The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the rugged streets of Pecos, Texas. When Thea Adams collapsed at the edge of town, her body broken from the cruelty she had escaped. She had been running for 3 days, hiding during daylight hours and moving only by night, but her strength had finally abandoned her. Her tattered dress, once a cheerful blue cotton, was stained with dirt and blood, and her bare feet were raw and bleeding. As darkness claimed her consciousness, she heard the steady rhythm of approaching hoofbeats. Rowdy Wells pulled back on the reins of his stallion when he spotted the crumpled form on the outskirts of town. At 29, he had seen his share of death and suffering in the harsh Texas frontier, but something about the small figure stirred an unfamiliar protective instinct. Dismounting with practiced ease, he approached cautiously, his hand hovering near the Colt revolver at his hip. "Madam." He called softly, kneeling beside her. When she didn't respond, he gently turned her over, revealing a face so bruised that her features were barely recognizable. Still, beneath the swelling and discoloration, he could tell she was young, perhaps in her early 20s. A surge of anger rose in his chest. Whoever had done this deserved a bullet between the eyes, but justice would have to wait. The woman was clinging to life by a thread, her breathing shallow and irregular. Without hesitation, Rowdy lifted her as gently as he could, surprised at how little she weighed. Her body felt fragile in his arms like a wounded bird. She stirred slightly, a whimper escaping her cracked lips. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe." Mounting his horse with the woman cradled against his chest was no simple task, but Rowdy managed it. He turned his horse toward the only place he knew might help Doc Sullivan's house on the edge of town. The doctor's wife, Martha Sullivan, opened the door before Rowdy could even knock. Her gray eyes widened at the sight of the beaten woman in his arms. "Good Lord," she whispered, stepping aside to let them in. "What happened to her? Don't know," Rowdy replied, carrying Thea to the examination room where Doc Sullivan was already rolling up his sleeves. "Found her collapsed at the edge of town." The doctor, a grizzled veteran of the Civil War with steady hands and a kind heart, gestured to the table. "Put her here. Martha, I'll need hot water and clean rags." Rowdy gently laid Thea down, noticing how her hand clutched weakly at his shirt as he pulled away. Something in the desperate gesture made his throat tighten. "Is she going to make it, Doc?" he asked quietly. Sullivan didn't answer immediately. He was too busy examining the extent of her injuries. Finally, he straightened up with a heavy sigh. "Hard to say. She's been beaten severely, multiple broken ribs, possibly internal bleeding, but she's young and appears strong underneath it all." He glanced at Rowdy with questioning eyes. "Any idea who she is?" Rowdy shook his head. "Never seen her before. Doesn't look like she's from around here." "Well, whoever did this to her might come looking. You planning to stay with her?" The question caught Rowdy off guard. He hadn't thought beyond bringing her to the doctor. But the idea of leaving her alone, vulnerable to whoever had hurt her, didn't sit right with him. "I reckon I will," he said finally. "At least until she wakes up and can tell us what happened." The doctor nodded, a hint of approval in his weathered face. "Martha will make up a cot for you in the corner." For 3 days, Thea drifted in and out of consciousness, trapped in a world of pain and fevered nightmares. Sometimes she would cry out, pleading with an unseen tormentor to stop. During these moments, Rowdy would take her hand and speak softly until she calmed. On the 4th day, her fever broke, and she opened her eyes fully for the first time. They were a startling amber color, like autumn leaves caught in sunlight. For a moment, she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, then at Rowdy sitting beside her bed. Fear instantly clouded her face and she tried to sit up, only to gasp in pain. "Easy," Rowdy said quickly, his voice gentle. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." "Where am I?" Her voice was barely audible, rough from disuse. "Pecos, Texas, Doc Sullivan's house. I found you at the edge of town, pretty beat up. Been looking after you these past few days." Thea's eyes darted around the room as if searching for escape routes. "He'll find me," she whispered. "He always does." "Who will?" Rowdy asked, leaning forward. Who did this to you? She shook her head slightly, wincing at the movement. I need to leave, I can't stay here. Madam, you can barely move, let alone travel. Whoever you're running from, I promise he won't get to you, not while I'm here. For the first time, she really looked at him, took in his sun-weathered face, the steady blue eyes, the set of his jaw that spoke of determination. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Rowdy considered her question. It was true, he had no obligation to this stranger. Yet something about her pulled at him, made him want to protect her from whatever demons pursued her. My ma raised me to help those who need it, he said simply. And right now, that's you. A shadow of distrust still lingered in her eyes, but exhaustion soon overtook her, and she drifted back to sleep. Rowdy settled back in his chair, his mind working through the possibilities. Who was this woman? And what kind of monster had hurt her so badly that she was terrified even in her weakened state? The next morning, Doc Sullivan came in to check on his patient. "Fever's gone," he announced after examining her. "That's a good sign, but those ribs will take weeks to heal properly. She won't be able to travel for some time." Thea, who was awake but silent, closed her eyes at this news. A tear slipped down her cheek. "I don't have weeks," she whispered. "He'll come for me." The doctor and Rowdy exchanged glances. "Who will come for you, dear?" Martha asked gently, having entered the room with a tray of broth. Thea's gaze flicked to the kind woman, then back to her hands. "My husband," she finally said, the word laced with fear. "Victor Adams." Rowdy felt a cold anger settling in his stomach. A husband. The man who had sworn to love and protect this woman had instead nearly killed her. "Your husband did this to you?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled rage. Thea nodded almost imperceptibly. "He owns half the businesses in Amarillo, has the law in his pocket. When I tried to leave him before," she trailed off, her hand unconsciously moving to a scar on her collarbone. "He said next time he'd kill me." "How did you get all the way to Pecos?" Martha asked, setting the tray down beside the bed. "Stole a horse," Thea admitted. "Rode as far as I could, then continued on foot when the horse went lame. I was trying to reach my aunt in El Paso. She's the only family I have left." "Well, you're in no condition to go anywhere right now," Doc Sullivan said firmly. "You'll stay here until you're healed enough to travel safely." "You don't understand," Thea insisted, desperation in her voice. "Victor won't stop. He'll find me and he'll hurt anyone who tries to help me." Rowdy stood up, his decision already made. "Let him try." Later that evening, after Thea had been helped to eat some broth and fallen back asleep, Rowdy stepped outside onto the doctor's porch. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Stars speckled the vast Texas sky, reminding him of how small human troubles really were in the grand scheme of things. Yet to Thea Adams, her troubles must seem as vast as the universe itself. Sheriff Dale Thompson approached, his boots crunching on the gravel path. "Evening, Rowdy. Heard you brought in some injured woman few days back." Rowdy nodded, sizing up the lawman. Dale was generally fair, but he was also practical to a fault, unlikely to get involved in what he'd consider a domestic matter. "She's been beaten half to death by her husband," Rowdy said bluntly. "Man named Victor Adams from Amarillo." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "Victor Adams, the railroad investor, you know him." "Know of him. Wealthy man, influential, heard he was looking for his runaway wife." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Said she was unstable, prone to self-harm." Rowdy's jaw clenched. "That's a damned lie. You ought to see what he did to her." "I'm not saying I believe him," Dale clarified. "Just telling you what I heard. Word is he's offering a substantial reward for information on her whereabouts." The implication was clear. In a town like Pecos, where most folks struggled to make ends meet, that kind of money could be tempting. "How many people know she's here?" Rowdy asked. "Not many yet, but secrets don't keep long in Pecos." Dale studied Rowdy's face in the dim light from the doctor's windows. "What's your stake in this, anyway? You never struck me as the type to get involved in other people's troubles." Rowdy considered the question. Why was he so invested in this woman's safety? He had always kept to himself, preferring the solitary life of a ranch hand to the complications of town life. Yet here he was, ready to face down a wealthy, powerful man for a woman he barely knew. "Someone needs to stand up for her," he said finally. "Might as well be me." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Just watch yourself. Men like Adams don't play by the rules the rest of us do." After Dale left, Rowdy returned inside to find Martha preparing to head home for the night. Doc Sullivan had a small apartment attached to his practice where he stayed when he had patients requiring overnight care. "I made up a proper bed for you in the spare room," Martha told him. "You can't keep sleeping in that chair. Your back will never forgive you." Rowdy thanked her but knew he wouldn't use it. He couldn't shake the feeling that Victor Adams already knew where his wife was hiding. And if the man came for her in the night, Rowdy intended to be right there, between Thea and any threat that might appear. As the days passed, Thea slowly began to heal. The bruises on her face faded from angry purple to sickly yellow, and she could breathe without wincing. Doc Sullivan declared her ribs were mending well, though she still couldn't stand or walk without assistance. During this time, Rowdy learned more about her. She was 24, the daughter of a shopkeeper who had died when she was 19. With no means to support herself, she had accepted Victor's proposal after a brief courtship, believing his promises of security and devotion. "He was charming at first," she told Rowdy one afternoon as he sat by her bedside. "Attentive, generous, but after we married, he changed, or maybe he just stopped pretending." "How long were you married before?" Rowdy gestured vaguely at her injuries. "The beating started 6 months in. At first, it was just when he drank, then it was whenever I disobeyed him." She traced a finger along the edge of her blanket. 3 years. I stayed for 3 years, telling myself it would get better, that I could change him somehow." "What made you finally leave?" Thea's eyes met his, unflinching despite the pain they held. "I found out I was with child, lost it after he pushed me down the stairs." Her voice broke slightly. "I couldn't let him take anything else from me. So I waited until he left for a business trip, took what little money I had saved, and ran." Rowdy felt a rage so intense it momentarily blinded him. Men like Victor Adams deserved a special kind of justice, the kind that came from the barrel of a gun. But he kept his voice steady for Thea's sake. "I'm sorry that happened to you. No one deserves that kind of treatment." She gave him a sad smile. "Most people say a wife should stand by her husband no matter what." "Most people are fools," Rowdy replied flatly. "A real man doesn't hurt those weaker than himself, he protects them." Thea studied him with those amber eyes that seemed to see right through him. "Like you're protecting me, I'm just doing what's right." A week passed, then another. Thea grew stronger each day, able to sit up on her own and even take a few steps with Rowdy's support. During this time, a quiet understanding developed between them. They spoke of simple things: his work on various ranches, her love of reading, the changing seasons in Texas. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, Rowdy whittling while Thea watched the patterns of light through the window. But the shadow of Victor Adams hung over them like a storm cloud on the horizon. Rowdy noticed strangers in town asking questions. Sheriff Dale reported that letters had arrived from Amarillo inquiring about Thea's whereabouts. The noose was tightening. On a warm evening in late April, Rowdy helped Thea onto the doctor's porch for some fresh air. She leaned heavily on his arm but managed to walk the short distance without too much pain. "Soon you'll be running races," he teased as he helped her into a rocking chair. "I never was much for running," she replied with a small smile. "But I'd settle for being able to walk across a room without feeling like I'm going to break in half." They sat in companionable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing across the plains. "When I'm well enough to travel," Thea said suddenly. "Will you help me get to El Paso?" Rowdy had been expecting this question, yet it still caught him off guard. Of course she would want to continue to her aunt's home. What had he expected? That she would stay in Pecos indefinitely, if that's what you want. he answered, keeping his voice neutral. Thea turned to look at him, her face serious in the fading light. What I want and what I need to do aren't always the same thing. Before Rowdy could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 4 riders were coming down the main street, heading straight for the doctor's house. Even in the dimming light, Rowdy recognized the lead rider's expensive clothes and commanding posture. "Get inside," he said urgently, helping Thea to her feet. "It's him." Terror flashed across Thea's face. "Victor," she whispered, her body beginning to tremble. "How did he find me? Doesn't matter now. Go." Rowdy ushered her into the house, calling for Doc Sullivan. "Keep her in the back room." "Lock the door." The doctor, understanding the gravity of the situation, quickly led Thea away. Rowdy stepped back onto the porch, his hand moving to rest on his revolver. He watched as the riders approached, his heartbeat steady despite the danger. This was a confrontation he had been preparing for. Victor Adams reined in his horse at the doctor's gate, his cold gray eyes taking in Rowdy's defensive stance. He was a handsome man in his late 30s, with the polished appearance of wealth and the hard eyes of someone used to getting his way. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," he called, his voice carrying the cultured tones of an Eastern education. "Nothing here belongs to you," Rowdy replied evenly. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My wife, Thea Adams, I've been searching for her for weeks. I have reason to believe she's being held here against her will. Nobody's being held against there will except maybe your horse, having to carry the likes of you." The 3 men with Victor hired guns by the look of them shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. But Victor raised a hand to stop them. "I understand you might have been misled by my wife's stories. She's unwell, you see, prone to delusions, self-harm. I only want to take her home where she can receive proper care." Rowdy's disgust must have shown on his face because Victor's expression hardened. "I have documents," he continued, reaching into his coat. "A doctor's testimony regarding her condition and papers from a judge granting me full authority over her welfare. The law is on my side, Cowboy." "The law might be," came a new voice, "but I'm not." Sheriff Dale Thompson stepped out of the shadows, his shotgun held casually but unmistakably pointed in Victor's general direction. "Evening, gentlemen. Seems we have a misunderstanding here." Victor's face showed a flicker of annoyance before smoothing back into a mask of concern. "Sheriff, I appreciate your dedication to your duties, but this is a private matter. My wife, your wife," Dale interrupted, "is currently under the protection of this town. And from what Doc Sullivan tells me, she's lucky to be alive after what you did to her." "Preposterous," Victor scoffed. "These injuries she claims I inflicted, she did them to herself during one of her episodes." "I have affidavits from reputable doctors in Amarillo, doctors you paid," Rowdy interjected. "Just like you probably paid off the law in Amarillo to look the other way." Victor's pretense of civility was beginning to crack. "You're interfering in matters you don't understand, ranch hand. Do you know who I am? What I can do to this miserable speck of a town if I choose to?" "I know exactly who you are," Rowdy replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "A coward who beats women, a man who thinks his money makes him above the law." For a moment it seemed Victor might order his men to attack. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, surprisingly, he smiled and relaxed in his saddle. "I see reason won't prevail tonight. Very well, but know this: I won't leave without my wife. One way or another, she will return with me to Amarillo." He looked directly at Rowdy. "And you, sir, will regret the day you decided to involve yourself in my business." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following close behind. Rowdy watched until they disappeared into the gathering darkness, then turned to the sheriff. "He'll be back," Dale said unnecessarily. "I know, with more men, most likely." "What's your plan, Rowdy? You can't fight off an army." Rowdy didn't immediately answer. His mind was already working through possibilities, none of them particularly promising. "We need to get Thea out of town, tonight if possible. She's still healing. Doc says she shouldn't travel yet. She'll die if she stays." Rowdy's voice was grim. Adams won't stop until he has her back, and we both know what will happen then. Dale sighed heavily, running a hand through his thinning hair. I can give you a day, maybe two. I'll spread word that she's already left town, headed north. Might buy you some time. I appreciate it, Dale. After the sheriff left, Rowdy went inside to find Thea sitting up in bed, her face pale with fear. Doc Sullivan stood nearby, looking troubled. He found me, she said quietly, just like I said he would. Rowdy sat on the edge of her bed, taking her hand in his. We're leaving tonight. Can you travel? She nodded without hesitation. I'll manage. It won't be easy. We'll need to avoid the main roads, travel at night when possible. I don't care how hard it is, Thea said firmly. Anything is better than going back to him. Doc Sullivan cleared his throat. I don't like this. She needs at least another week of rest before attempting such a journey. We don't have a week, Doc, Rowdy replied. Adams will be back with more men, and when he does, he won't be asking nicely. The doctor reluctantly agreed, knowing Rowdy was right. At least let me pack some medical supplies for you, and take my old wagon. It has a covered bed where she can lie down. Within hours, they were ready. Martha had packed food, blankets, and a few changes of clothes for Thea. Doc Sullivan provided bandages, pain remedies, and strict instructions for Thea's continuing care. Under the cover of darkness, Rowdy helped Thea into the back of the wagon, making her as comfortable as possible on a pallet of blankets. She winced with each movement but didn't complain. Her courage in the face of pain and fear only deepened Rowdy's respect for her. Ready? He asked, checking that she was secure. She nodded, reaching out to squeeze his hand. Thank you, Rowdy, for everything. Don't thank me yet. We've got a long journey ahead. They left Pecos by a little-used trail that wound through a ravine to the southwest, avoiding the main road. Rowdy's plan was to head toward El Paso by a roundabout route, staying off the established trails where Victor's men might be watching. The first night of travel was difficult. Every bump in the trail caused Thea pain, though she tried to hide it. By dawn, they had covered only 15 miles, and Rowdy knew they needed to find a place to rest during the day. They couldn't risk moving in daylight when they might be easily spotted. He found a small box canyon with a spring, hidden by a stand of cottonwoods. It would provide shelter and water, and the trees would hide the smoke from a small fire. Rowdy helped Thea down from the wagon, noticing how she leaned heavily against him. "You're in pain," he said, concern evident in his voice. "I'm fine," she insisted, but her pale face and shallow breathing told a different story. Once he had made her comfortable in the shade, Rowdy set about caring for the horses and preparing a simple meal. He was no cook, but he could manage bacon and coffee. As he worked, he kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings, alert for any sign of pursuit. Thea watched him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You're good at this," she observed. "Being on the move, surviving in the wild," Rowdy shrugged. "Spent most of my life outdoors. Working cattle drives, hunting, scouting for the army for a spell, you learn to be self-sufficient." "Is that why you never settled down? Because you prefer being free?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't thought much about why he lived the way he did. "It was just the way things had worked out. Never found a reason to stay in one place, I reckon," he finally answered. "No family to speak of since Ma died, no ties. Makes it easier to move on when the work dries up or things get complicated." "And now?" Thea asked quietly. "Things seem pretty complicated." Rowdy met her gaze, seeing the unspoken question in her eyes. What was he doing, risking his life for her? Why had he chosen to get involved in her troubles when his usual instinct was to avoid entanglements? "Some things are worth complicating your life for," he said simply. They spent the day resting, speaking little. Thea slept fitfully, her dreams obviously troubled. Rowdy kept watch, his rifle across his lap, listening for the sound of approaching riders. But the only visitors were a family of deer that came to drink at the spring and a hawk that circled lazily overhead. As dusk fell, they prepared to move on. Thea seemed stronger after her rest, able to stand without support for short periods. She insisted on helping pack up their small camp, though Rowdy tried to make her rest. "I'm not made of glass," she told him firmly, "and I won't be a burden." "You're not a burden," he replied. "You're the bravest woman I've ever met." Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Thea looked away, a flush coloring her cheeks. "We should get moving before it gets too dark to see the trail." They traveled through the night, the moon providing enough light to follow the rough path Rowdy had chosen. The land grew increasingly rugged as they moved southwest, with steep arroyos and rocky outcrops that made travel slow and difficult. But the challenging terrain also offered countless places to hide, which was exactly what they needed. By the third night of their journey, Thea was noticeably stronger. She could now sit up front with Rowdy for short periods, though the jostling of the wagon still caused her pain. During these times, they talked about their lives before meeting. Rowdy told her about growing up on a small farm in East Texas, losing his father to a cattle rustler's bullet when he was 12, helping his mother keep the farm going until drought and debt finally forced them to sell. How after his mother died of pneumonia when he was 20, he had drifted west, working wherever he could find employment, never staying long in any one place. Thea spoke of her childhood in St. Louis, the daughter of a moderately successful merchant. How after her mother died, her father had moved them to Amarillo for a fresh start. She had been educated at home by a series of tutors, trained to be a proper lady who would make an advantageous marriage. Victor Adams, with his wealth and social standing, had seemed the perfect match. "My father died just before the wedding," she said softly as they made their way through a narrow valley. "Looking back, I think Victor was just waiting for that to happen. Once father was gone, there was no one to notice if I was truly happy." Rowdy's hands tightened on the reins. "Your father wouldn't have let him hurt you." "No, he wouldn't have. He was a gentle man but fierce when it came to protecting those he loved." She was silent for a moment. "Sometimes I wonder if he would be disappointed in me, for staying as long as I did, for not being stronger." "You survived," Rowdy said firmly. "That takes more strength than most people will ever know." On the fourth day, disaster struck. They had found shelter in an abandoned miner's cabin tucked into the side of a hill. Rowdy had gone hunting, hoping to supplement their dwindling supplies with fresh meat. He had just brought down a rabbit when he heard the unmistakable sound of horses approaching. Quickly, he concealed himself in a thicket, watching as 4 riders came into view. They weren't Victor's men from Pecos, but they carried the unmistakable look of hired guns. One of them was tracking, bending low in his saddle to study the ground. "Tracks lead this way," the man called to his companions. "Wagons been through here recently?" Rowdy's heart sank. They had been found, and Thea was alone in the cabin, still too weak to run if these men discovered her. He had to get back to her, but moving now would only draw attention to himself. So he waited, barely breathing, as the men continued on the trail that led directly to the cabin. Once they were out of sight, Rowdy circled wide, using the terrain to conceal his approach. He reached the back of the cabin just as he heard men dismounting out front. Through a crack in the wall, he could see Thea inside, her face tense as she listened to the approaching footsteps. Making a split-second decision, Rowdy tapped softly on the back wall. Thea's head jerked up, her eyes wide with fear until she recognized his signal 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. It was a code they had established for just such an emergency. Moving silently to the back window, she opened it just as the men began pounding on the front door. Rowdy helped her through the opening, ignoring the pain that flashed across her face at the sudden movement. "Adams' men," she whispered as he led her into the cover of the trees behind the cabin. He nodded grimly. "Different ones. He must have hired every gun for hire between here and Amarillo." The sound of wood splintering told them the men had broken down the door. Soon they would discover the cabin empty and the hunt would begin in earnest. They needed to move quickly, but the wagon was hitched out front, clearly visible to the gunmen. "We'll have to go on foot," Rowdy said, his mind racing. There's a ridge about 2 miles south. If we can reach it before they organize a search, we might be able to find another way down to the valley. Thea nodded, determination replacing the fear in her eyes. I can make it. Rowdy wasn't so sure. 2 miles of rough terrain would be challenging even for someone in peak condition, let alone a woman still recovering from severe injuries. But they had no choice. He took her hand and together they slipped deeper into the woods. The going was painfully slow. Thea did her best, but every step was an effort for her. Rowdy supported her as much as he could, sometimes practically carrying her over the most difficult stretches. Behind them, they could hear shouting as the men discovered their absence and began searching. "Leave me," Thea gasped after nearly an hour of flight. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the ridge, and she was clearly at the end of her strength. "They want me, not you." "You can still get away." Rowdy's answer was to scoop her up into his arms, ignoring her protests. "I'm not leaving you, not now, not ever, unless you tell me to go." She stared up at him, surprise and something else, something warmer in her amber eyes. Then she wrapped her arms around his neck, trusting him to carry her to safety. The weight of her in his arms was both burden and blessing. His muscles strained with the effort of carrying her over the uneven ground, but he pressed on, driven by the need to keep her safe. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as the men searched in the wrong direction. By the time they reached the ridge, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. Rowdy was exhausted, his shirt soaked with sweat, but he had done it. Thea was safe, at least for the moment. He set her down gently in the shelter of a rock outcropping, then collapsed beside her, his chest heaving with exertion. Thea immediately turned to him, concern written on her face. "You're completely worn out," she said, touching his face with a cool hand. "And all because of me." Rowdy caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. "Worth it," he managed between breaths. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them. The barriers they had both maintained he out of respect for her vulnerable position, she out of fear and uncertainty began to crumble. Slowly, hesitantly, Thea leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, questioning, over almost before it began, but it changed everything. When Thea pulled back, her eyes searching his face for a reaction, Rowdy felt as though his world had been turned upside down. "I shouldn't have done that," she whispered, misinterpreting his stunned silence. "You've been so kind, and I've taken advantage." Rowdy silenced her with a finger to her lips. "You didn't take advantage of anything. I've been wanting to do that since the moment you opened those beautiful eyes of yours in Doc Sullivan's house." Relief washed over her face, followed by a shy smile that transformed her features. For the first time since he'd met her, Thea looked truly happy. The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of voices. The men were still searching, and while they weren't close, they hadn't given up. Rowdy and Thea spent an uncomfortable night on the ridge, huddled together for warmth, alert for any sign of their pursuers. By morning, the immediate danger had passed. The men had apparently returned to the cabin, perhaps hoping Rowdy and Thea would circle back for the wagon, but their situation remained precarious. They were on foot in rugged country, with limited supplies and at least a week's journey still ahead of them. "We need to find transportation," Rowdy said as they shared the rabbit he had killed the day before, roasted over a small, smokeless fire. "And more food." Thea nodded, her face determined despite the pain and fatigue evident in her eyes. "There's a town marked on the map Doc Sullivan gave us, Los Pinos. It can't be more than 20 miles from here." 20 miles is a long way without horses. "We've come this far," she replied with a hint of steel in her voice. "What's 20 more miles?" Rowdy smiled, admiration warming his chest. "You're something else, Thea Adams." "I wasn't always," she said softly. "Before I met Victor, I was sheltered, naive. I thought the world was a generally good place and people were mostly kind." Her expression turned reflective. "In a strange way, I should thank him. He taught me how cruel the world can be, but also how to survive it." Rowdy reached out, taking her hand in his. "And now?" "What do you think of the world now?" She looked at him, her amber eyes clear and direct. I think there's both darkness and light, and I think sometimes when you're deep in the darkness, the light finds you anyway. They set out for Los Pinos later that morning, moving carefully to avoid open ground where they might be spotted. Thea could walk now, though slowly and with Rowdy's support. The terrain gradually became less rugged as they descended from the ridge, transitioning to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and scrub oak. Progress was slow but steady. Rowdy insisted on frequent rests, worried about taxing Thea's strength too much. During these breaks, they talked more openly than before, the kiss on the ridge having broken down some invisible barrier between them. Rowdy told her about his dreams of someday owning his own ranch, a modest spread where he could raise horses. Thea spoke of her love of books and her secret desire to become a teacher. Victor laughed when I mentioned it, she said as they sat in the shade of a large oak. Said no wife of his would work like a common schoolmarm, but I've always loved learning and sharing that with children would be a joy. You'd make a fine teacher, Rowdy said sincerely. Patient, kind, but with enough backbone to keep the rowdy ones in line. She smiled at his choice of words. Speaking from experience, Mr. Wells, maybe, he admitted with a grin. I wasn't the easiest student. More interested in horses than history. As they continued their journey, Rowdy found himself drawn more and more to Thea's quiet strength and gentle humor. She never complained, even when he knew she must be in pain. And she had a way of finding beauty in their harsh surroundings that made him see the familiar landscape with new eyes. By nightfall, they had covered perhaps 8 miles, not the progress Rowdy had hoped for, but better than he had feared. They made camp in a small gully where a trickle of water provided enough to drink and wash the dust from their faces. Their food was nearly gone, just a few strips of jerky and the last of the hardtack Martha had packed. I'll try to hunt at first light, Rowdy said as they sat close together, conserving warmth as the desert night grew chilly. Might be able to get a rabbit or some quail. Thea leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. I never thought I'd be so hungry I'd look forward to rabbit stew. Growing up, I was such a picky eater. My father used to tease me about it. My mother would have said you hadn't lived until you'd been truly hungry, Rowdy replied, putting his arm around her. She was full of sayings like that. Hunger is the best sauce, sleep when you're dead. A closed mouth catches no flies. She sounds wonderful, she was. Tough as rawhide but soft-hearted underneath. You remind me of her sometimes. Thea looked up at him, surprised. I do. The way you never give up. How you face what comes without flinching. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. She would have liked you. I wish I could have met her. The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. It suggested a future where their lives remained connected, where what they felt for each other might have a chance to grow into something lasting. Rowdy wanted that future with an intensity that startled him. He had never been one to plan beyond the next season, the next job. But now he found himself thinking of what might be a home with Thea, perhaps children someday. It was a dangerous thing to want when their lives were still so uncertain, when Victor Adams still hunted them. As if reading his thoughts, Thea spoke quietly. What happens if we make it to El Paso? If we get away from Victor? When, Rowdy corrected gently. When we make it to El Paso, she smiled at his confidence. When then, what happens to us? Rowdy considered his answer carefully. He wasn't a man given to flowery declarations or grand promises, but Thea deserved honesty. I'd like there to be an us, he said finally. If that's what you want too, I'm not a wealthy man and the life I could offer wouldn't be easy, but I'd work every day to make you happy, to keep you safe. Thea's eyes shimmered in the dim light. I don't need wealth. I had that with Victor and it was a gilded cage. She placed her hand over his heart. I just need this, someone true, someone kind. Rowdy covered her hand with his own, feeling as though his heart might burst from his chest. Then you have me, for as long as you want me. Their lips met in a kiss that held both tenderness and promise, sealing their words in the most ancient way humans knew. When they finally parted, Thea's smile held a contentment Rowdy had never seen before. We should try to sleep, he said reluctantly. Tomorrow will be another long day. They settled down together, sharing the single blanket they had managed to grab from the cabin. Despite their precarious situation low on supplies, being hunted miles from safety, Rowdy felt a curious peace. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Dawn brought a pleasant surprise. While hunting for breakfast, Rowdy discovered fresh tracks that led him to a small ranch just 2 miles from their campsite. The owner, an elderly Mexican man named Eduardo Mendoza, was initially suspicious of the dusty, armed stranger who appeared at his door. But when Rowdy explained their situation, a woman fleeing an abusive husband, seeking safety in El Paso, Eduardo's weathered face softened. "My sister suffered at the hands of such a man," he said in accented English. "I could not help her then. Perhaps I can help your lady now." Eduardo not only fed them a hot meal of eggs and beans, but also offered them the use of his wagon and team to continue their journey. "My son will come from El Paso next week with supplies. He can bring the wagon back then." Rowdy was overwhelmed by the man's generosity. "I can't accept such a gift, at least let me pay you." Eduardo waved away the offer. "It is not a gift, it is what one human does for another in need." He looked at Thea, who was resting on a cot in the corner of his small home. "Besides, your lady should not walk so far in her condition." With renewed hope and a proper means of transportation, Rowdy and Thea set out again after a few hours of rest. The wagon wasn't as comfortable as Doc Sullivan's, but Eduardo had padded it with blankets to ease the journey for Thea. He had also provided them with food, water, and even a shotgun for additional protection. "God go with you," the old rancher said as they departed, "and if you ever need shelter again, my home is open to you." The remainder of their journey to Los Pinos was much easier with the wagon. They arrived late the following day to find a small but busy settlement centered around a silver mine. The town consisted of a single main street lined with the usual establishments: a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and a church. Rowdy decided they would stay the night at the hotel. They both needed a proper rest, and Thea especially could use a real bed and a hot bath. The risk of being recognized seemed minimal in such a remote location. The hotel was modest but clean, run by a stern-faced widow named Mrs. Hollister, who softened considerably when she saw Thea's condition. Assuming they were a married couple who had fallen on hard times, she gave them her best room at a reduced rate. "Thank you, Mrs. Wells," she said as she handed Thea the key. "Dinner is served at 6 in the dining room." Thea blushed at being addressed as Rowdy's wife but didn't correct the assumption. Later, as they sat in their room, Rowdy having insisted on taking the floor while Thea had the bed, she brought it up. "She thinks we're married," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Easier that way," Rowdy replied. "People ask fewer questions about a husband and wife traveling together." "Yes, I suppose they do." She was quiet for a moment. "It felt strange hearing myself called Mrs. Wells, strange but not unpleasant." Rowdy looked up at her, trying to read her expression in the dim light of the oil lamp. No, she met his gaze steadily. "I think I could get used to it, someday." The implication of her words sent a thrill through him. "Someday," he agreed softly, "when you're ready, when you're free." They stayed in Los Pinos for 2 days, allowing Thea to regain her strength. Rowdy was cautious, keeping watch for any sign of Victor's men, but the town seemed blissfully unaware of their situation. They used the time to replenish their supplies and gather information about the final leg of their journey to El Paso. According to the locals, they still had about 100 miles to go, a journey that would take at least a week with the wagon. The route would take them through some rough country, including a stretch known as the Devil's Corridor, a narrow pass between steep cliffs that was notorious for bandit attacks. "We'll go around," Rowdy decided after hearing these reports. "It'll add a couple of days to the journey, but better safe than sorry." Thea agreed readily. She had been making remarkable progress in her recovery, able now to walk short distances without support and even help with small tasks around camp. But she was still far from full strength, and another confrontation, whether with bandits or Victor's men, could prove disastrous. They left Los Pinos early on the third morning, their wagon well stocked with provisions. The terrain grew increasingly arid as they traveled west, the vegetation sparse except along the occasional dry creek bed. Heat became their constant companion, the sun beating down relentlessly during the day, forcing them to travel in the early morning and late afternoon, resting during the hottest hours. Despite the harsh conditions, these days were among the happiest either of them had known. Free from immediate danger, able to talk openly about their growing feelings for each other, they began to build a foundation for whatever future awaited them. Rowdy found himself telling Thea things he had never shared with anyone, his fears of never finding a place to truly belong, his regrets over not being with his mother when she died, his dreams for a life that had always seemed just out of reach. And Thea, in turn, spoke of her own hopes and fears, gradually shedding the protective shell she had developed during her years with Victor. "I used to love singing," she confessed one evening as they sat by their campfire, "before I was married. My mother taught me and we would sing together while she played the piano." "Why did you stop?" Rowdy asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Victor didn't like it, said I was embarrassing him with my caterwauling." She smiled sadly. "After a while I just forgot how. Or maybe I forgot that I was allowed to enjoy something simply because it made me happy." "Would you sing for me?" Rowdy asked gently. "If you want to, I mean." Thea hesitated, then nodded. In a soft, sweet voice that gained strength as she continued, she sang an old folk song about a lover waiting for her beloved to return from the sea. The simple melody floated on the night air, hauntingly beautiful against the backdrop of the vast, star-studded sky. When she finished, Rowdy was silent for a long moment, moved beyond words by the vulnerability and trust she had shown him. "That was beautiful," he finally said. "Like you." Thea blushed but looked pleased. "Thank you for asking me to sing, for helping me remember." "Sing whenever you want," Rowdy told her. "I'll never get tired of hearing it." As they continued their journey, taking the longer route around the Devil's Corridor, Rowdy began teaching Thea how to handle the wagon and team. She proved a quick study, soon able to take the reins for short stretches while he rode alongside on the horse Eduardo had lent them. "My father would be scandalized," she laughed as she confidently guided the horses through a shallow stream. "A proper lady, driving a wagon like a common teamster." "You're doing a sight better than most teamsters I've known," Rowdy replied with a grin. "Besides, out here, being useful matters more than being proper." On the 10th day after leaving Pecos, they crossed a ridge and saw, in the far distance, the scattered buildings of El Paso. The sight filled them both with conflicting emotions: relief at having nearly reached their destination, but also uncertainty about what would happen next. "My aunt lives on the outskirts of town," Thea said as they made camp that night, perhaps 2 days' journey from El Paso. "She has a small house with a garden. She writes that she grows the most beautiful roses." "Sounds nice," Rowdy said, trying to keep his voice neutral. They had yet to discuss what would happen once they reached Thea's aunt. Would she still want him in her life? Or would she prefer to start fresh, without reminders of her difficult journey? Thea seemed to sense his thoughts. She moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. "I want you to stay," she said simply. "If you want to." Rowdy looked at her, this woman who had come to mean everything to him. "I want to," he assured her, "but are you sure? Your aunt might not approve of a rough cowboy like me. Aunt Harriet is the least judgmental person I know. She'll love you because I do." The words slipped out naturally, as if she had said them 100 times before, though it was the first time either of them had spoken of love. Rowdy's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. "You do?" Thea met his gaze steadily, though a blush colored her cheeks. "I do. I love you, Rowdy Wells. You saved me in every way a person can be saved, and I fell in love with you somewhere along the way." In answer, Rowdy pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of her still healing ribs, and kissed her with all the tenderness and passion he felt. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too, Thea. Have since almost the beginning, I think." He kissed her again softly. "Never thought I'd find someone like you, never thought I deserved to." "You deserve everything good," she whispered, her eyes shining with emotion. "And I intend to spend however long you'll have me proving it to you." They held each other as night descended, wrapped in the warmth of newfound declarations and future promises. For the first time since they had fled Pecos, Rowdy allowed himself to truly believe they might have a future together, a home, a family, a life built on love rather than fear. But fate had one more test in store for them. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the promise of another scorching day ahead. They broke camp early, hoping to cover as much ground as possible before the worst of the heat set in. Thea was in good spirits, singing softly as she helped pack their belongings into the wagon. They had been traveling for perhaps 2 hours when Rowdy spotted a dust cloud in the distance behind them. Riders moving fast, too fast for casual travelers. "Thea," he said, keeping his voice calm, "take the reins. Keep heading west as fast as the horses can manage without tiring." She followed his gaze to the dust cloud, her face paling. "Victor, can't be sure from this distance, but we can't take chances." He checked his revolver, then the shotgun Eduardo had given them. "I'll ride behind, try to slow them down if it comes to that." "No." Thea's voice was sharp with fear. "We stay together, please, Rowdy." He wanted to argue, to insist that he could buy her time to reach safety, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She had been abandoned before, left to face danger alone. He couldn't do that to her, not even with the best of intentions. "Together," he agreed. "But we need to move fast. Those horses of Eduardo's aren't built for speed, but they've got endurance. If we can keep ahead until nightfall, we might lose them in the dark." They pushed on, the wagon rattling over the uneven ground as Thea urged the team to a steady trot. Rowdy rode alongside, constantly checking their back trail. The dust cloud was definitely closer now, and he could make out individual riders, 6 of them, moving with purpose. By midday, their pursuers had closed the gap significantly. Rowdy could now see that they were indeed armed men, though he couldn't yet distinguish faces. The wagon team was beginning to tire, their pace slowing despite Thea's encouragement. "We need to find somewhere defensible," Rowdy said, scanning the terrain ahead. "Somewhere we can make a stand if it comes to that." Thea nodded grimly. She had come too far, endured too much, to be taken back now. "Whatever happens," she said, "I won't go back to him. I'd rather die." "It won't come to that," Rowdy promised, though his heart clenched at her words. "I won't let it." About a mile ahead, the trail wound between 2 large rock formations, not ideal, but better than open ground if they had to fight. Rowdy directed Thea toward this natural choke point, hoping to use the terrain to their advantage. They had just reached the entrance to the narrow pass when a rifle shot cracked the air, the bullet kicking up dust near the wagon wheel. Thea flinched but kept control of the team, guiding them into the relative shelter of the rocks. "They're within range," Rowdy said unnecessarily, his voice tight. "Keep going as far as you can into the pass. I'll cover our back." He dismounted at a spot where the rock wall provided some protection, tying his horse to a scrubby bush. Taking the shotgun and his rifle, he positioned himself to watch the approach to the pass. Thea continued on with the wagon, stopping about 50 yards and where the trail widened slightly. The riders slowed as they approached the entrance to the pass, clearly wary of an ambush. One man, taller than the others and wearing a distinctive black hat, raised his hand to halt the group. Even at this distance, Rowdy recognized Thea Adams, Theodora. The man called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "I know you're in there. Come out now and I'll be merciful. Continue this foolishness and you'll watch your cowboy die before I take you home." Rowdy's grip tightened on his rifle. 6 against 1 weren't odds he liked, but he'd faced worse and survived. And he had the advantage of position. They would have to come at him one or two at a time through the narrow entrance. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Thea appeared at his side, the small revolver he had given her for protection in her hand. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "Get back to the wagon." "I told you," she said calmly. "We stay together, and I'm done hiding from him." Before Rowdy could stop her, she stepped forward, still within the protection of the rocks but visible to the men outside. "I'm not coming back, Victor," she called, her voice steady. "Not ever. The next time you see me will be in court, where I'll testify to every bruise, every broken bone, every humiliation you inflicted on me. Or you can leave now, go back to Amarillo, and never come looking for me again." Victor's laugh was cold, devoid of humor. Bold words from a woman who, until recently, couldn't even stand without help. Did your cowboy fill your head with these ideas of independence? He must be quite the hero in your eyes. "He is," Thea replied simply. "More of a man than you could ever hope to be." Even from a distance, Rowdy could see the rage that transformed Victor's face. "Enough of this," he snarled. "Men, bring her out. Kill the cowboy if he interferes." Two of the hired guns dismounted, drawing their weapons as they prepared to enter the pass. Rowdy raised his rifle, sighting on the lead man. "That's far enough," he warned. "Next step you take will be your last." The men hesitated, looking to Victor for direction. He was clearly unaccustomed to having his orders questioned or defied. "She's my wife," he snapped. "I have every right to reclaim her." "Not anymore," came a new voice from behind Rowdy and Thea. They turned to see Sheriff Dale Thompson and 3 deputies emerging from the far end of the pass, weapons drawn. Dale had apparently followed them all the way from Pecos, perhaps suspecting that Victor would not give up his pursuit. "You're a long way from your jurisdiction, Sheriff," Victor said coldly. "Got a telegram from the federal marshal in El Paso," Dale replied, moving to stand beside Rowdy. "Seems Mrs. Adams there filed for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty before she fled Amarillo. Judge granted it in absentia after reviewing the evidence she left with her lawyer. She ain't your wife anymore, Adams, and you're wanted for attempted murder." Victor's face contorted with fury. "Lies." "She's mentally unstable, prone to self-harm, save it for the judge," Dale cut him off. "Now, you and your men drop those weapons or this gets ugly real fast." For a tense moment, it seemed Victor might order his men to fight. Rowdy tightened his finger on the trigger, preparing for the worst. Then, with a curse, Victor raised his hands in surrender. His men, hired for their guns rather than their loyalty, quickly followed suit. As Dale and his deputies moved forward to disarm and handcuff the men, Thea sagged against Rowdy, the strength that had sustained her during the confrontation suddenly deserting her. "It's over," she whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. "It's really over." Rowdy wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as the tension of the past weeks finally released. "Yes," he murmured into her hair, "it's over. You're free." 2 days later, they arrived in El Paso. Dale had escorted Victor and his men back to Amarillo to face justice, but not before ensuring that Rowdy and Thea reached their destination safely. The sheriff had become a friend during their shared ordeal, and his parting words to Rowdy had been both congratulatory and cautionary. "You found yourself a remarkable woman there," he had said, clasping Rowdy's hand. "Treat her right or you'll have me to answer to." "I intend to," Rowdy had replied with a smile. "Every day for the rest of our lives if she'll have me." Harriet Taylor, Thea's aunt, proved to be everything her niece had described: kind, welcoming, and utterly without judgment. A small, energetic woman in her 60s with Thea's same amber eyes, she embraced them both upon their arrival, ushering them into her modest but comfortable home as if their appearance on her doorstep was the most natural thing in the world. "So you're the young man who brought my Thea safely to me," she said, studying Rowdy with keen eyes. "And from what she tells me, you did a great deal more than that." "He saved me," Thea said simply, her hand finding Rowdy's. "In every way possible." Harriet's gaze softened as she observed the way they looked at each other. "Well then, young man, it seems you've earned a place at our table for as long as you care to stay." That first night, as they sat on Harriet's porch watching the sunset paint the Franklin Mountains in shades of gold and purple, Rowdy made his decision. He had been carrying his mother's ring, a simple silver band with a small pearl, ever since leaving Pecos, waiting for the right moment. "Thea," he began, suddenly nervous despite all they had been through together, "I know it hasn't been long, and maybe this is too soon after everything you've endured. But yes," she interrupted, her eyes shining. Rowdy blinked in confusion. "You don't even know what I'm going to ask." Thea laughed, the sound like music to his ears. "Yes, I do, and yes, I will marry you, Rowdy Wells, tomorrow, next month, next year, whenever you think the time is right." He pulled the ring from his pocket, holding it out to her. "It was my mother's." "Nothing fancy, but it's perfect," Thea said softly, allowing him to slip it onto her finger. "And so is this moment." They were married 3 months later in Harriet's rose garden, a simple ceremony attended by a few friends, including Doc and Martha Sullivan, who made the journey from Pecos, and Sheriff Dale Thompson, who came bearing news that Victor Adams had been convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison for his crimes. With Harriet's blessing, they built a small house on her property, and Rowdy found work breaking horses at a nearby ranch. His reputation as a skilled horseman grew quickly, and within a year, he was able to purchase a modest plot of land outside El Paso, where they began to build their dream, a small horse ranch where Rowdy could breed and train the strong, intelligent animals he had always admired. Thea, meanwhile, fulfilled her dream of becoming a teacher, first by tutoring children in their homes, then by establishing a small school in their community for children who lived too far from town to attend regular classes. Her gentle but firm teaching style made her beloved by her students and respected by their parents. 2 years after their marriage, their family grew with the birth of their son, James Edward Wells, named for both their fathers. A daughter, Sarah, followed 18 months later, and in time, 2 more sons joined the family. Their home was filled with love, laughter, and occasionally chaos, everything Rowdy and Thea had once thought beyond their reach. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, they stood together on the porch of their ranch house, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set over the mountains. "Did you ever imagine we would end up here?" Thea asked, leaning into her husband's embrace. "That day when you found me on the outskirts of Pecos." Rowdy thought back to that moment, the broken woman he had discovered, too weak from beatings to stand, whom he had carried until she could walk again. How that act of simple humanity had changed both their lives immeasurably. "No," he admitted, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was just trying to do the right thing. Never imagined I'd find everything I never knew I was looking for." Thea turned in his arms, her amber eyes as bright and beautiful as the day he'd first seen them. "I'm glad you found me," she whispered. "I'm glad you didn't ride past." "Never could have," Rowdy replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Something told me my whole life was waiting there at the edge of town, and darlin', I was right." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they remained on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, savoring the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. Their journey had been filled with danger and pain, but it had led them here to a love that had healed them both, to a family built on kindness and respect, to a home where shadows from the past could no longer reach them. And as night fell completely over their little corner of Texas, Thea began to sing softly, her sweet voice carrying on the gentle breeze. Rowdy closed his eyes, listening to the woman he loved, surrounded by the life they had built together, and knew with absolute certainty that this moment, this love, this life was what he had been searching for all along. In the years that followed, their ranch prospered, becoming known throughout the region for its fine horses. Rowdy's skill as a trainer and breeder brought buyers from as far away as California and Missouri, while Thea's school grew to accommodate dozens of children, eventually moving into a proper building donated by grateful parents. Their own children thrived in the loving environment their parents had created. James showed his father's affinity for horses from an early age, while Sarah inherited her mother's love of learning and teaching. The younger boys, Michael and Thomas, developed their own distinct personalities and interests, Michael as something of an inventor, always tinkering with machines, and Thomas as an artist with an eye for the beauty of the southwestern landscape. Thea never forgot the darkness she had escaped, but she refused to let it define her. Instead, she channeled her experiences into helping other women in similar situations. With Harriet's support and Rowdy's encouragement, she established a sanctuary on the edge of their property, a safe place where women fleeing abuse could find shelter, support, and the strength to build new lives. "Every woman deserves the chance I had," she told Rowdy when she first proposed the idea. "Not everyone finds a hero to carry them to safety." "You're the hero in that story," he replied, his admiration evident in his voice. "I just helped a bit along the way." As their children grew and the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Rowdy and Thea weathered the changes together. They saw the arrival of automobiles in El Paso, the gradual taming of the once wild frontier, the shifting of old ways to new. Through it all, their love remained constant, deepening with each passing year, each shared joy and sorrow. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered to celebrate. The small ranch had grown into a prosperous enterprise, the modest house expanded to accommodate their large family. As evening fell, Thea found Rowdy sitting on their favorite bench beneath the old oak tree that had stood witness to so much of their life together. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, sitting beside him. At 49, her hair was now streaked with silver and fine lines marked the corners of her eyes, but to Rowdy, she was as beautiful as the day he had first seen her truly smile. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he replied, taking her hand in his. "How different my life might have been if I hadn't ridden into Pecos that evening." Thea squeezed his hand. "I believe some things are meant to be, that no matter what paths we took, somehow we would have found each other." Rowdy smiled at her romantic notion. "Maybe you're right. All I know is that carrying you until you could walk again was the best thing I ever did. And watching you grow stronger each day, seeing you become the remarkable woman you are, has been the greatest privilege of my life." "We carried each other," Thea corrected gently, "and we still do, every day." As the stars appeared overhead, much as they had on that night in the wilderness when they had first declared their love, Rowdy and Thea Wells sat together in peaceful contemplation of all they had built and all that still lay ahead. Their journey had begun in darkness and pain, but it had led them into a light brighter than either could have imagined, the enduring light of a love that had healed old wounds, conquered fears, and ultimately transformed two broken souls into one unbreakable whole. And in the gentle night breeze, as their family laughed and celebrated nearby, Thea began to sing the same sweet melody she had first shared with Rowdy around a campfire so many years ago. Her voice, still clear and true after all this time, carried the simple words of love and longing, of waiting and homecoming, of two hearts finding their way to each other across whatever distance might separate them. Rowdy closed his eyes, listening to the woman he loved with every fiber of his being, and knew with absolute certainty that this moment, this love, this life they had created together was everything he had ever needed, and more than he had ever dared to dream.